Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We'd like to start the next session, which is an interview with Mr. Robert Zoellick. Please take your seats, ladies and gentlemen, and those outside, if you'd like to join us. Thank you. I hand you over now to Ambassador Chan Heng-Chi. Heng-Chi, please.
Thank you. Well, this session is entitled A Conversation with Robert Zoellick. I'm pleased to welcome Robert Zoellick, the Honorable Robert Zoellick, to the Milken Institute Asia Summit. Mr. Zoellick, in a room like this, needs no introduction, but I will give him one. He was the USTR during George W. Bush's first term, President George W. Bush's administration. And he was Deputy Secretary of State from 2005 to 2007. And he became the 11th President of the World Bank from 2007 to 2012. Today, he is chairman of the Goldman Sachs International Advisors, and he's at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. I cannot think of anyone better to discuss global issues, economic, political, international, than Mr. Zoellick. Now, Bob, I'm going to begin with what's in the news, hot off the wires. The vote on Scottish independence has taken place, and this is the morning after. The news out is that sterling has gone up. CNN reports now that so far, at this count, is 58 for no and 42 for yes. Your thoughts on this, please?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be with the Milken Institute. And what Ambassador Chan hasn't told you was that the main reason I wanted to come was because she was such a superb ambassador of the United States for many years, the best that we had, and it's always a pleasure to have a chance to talk to her. Even on subjects such as Scottish independence, noting that Singapore has one of the best bagpipe troops.
Yes, women bagpipers.
Well, we don't have the final results, so obviously one has to be a little circumspect on this. But as I had mentioned to the Financial Times, I think many Americans have a great respect for Scottish heritage. Obviously, the Scots have played a great role in U.S. history, but also globally. And so while there's a sort of emotional attachment to some of the symbolisms of Scotland, I think there's also a sense that this would have been a great tragedy for the United Kingdom and for Scotland, in part because as we survey the challenges in the world, and this is one of the questions about the U.S. role, the U.S. needs partners. The United Kingdom is one of the most important partners for the United States, and obviously the breakup would be a diminution of Britain, and it would certainly preoccupy the British officials. And I think there's one other aspect of this, which is something that really affects all societies, and that is what you saw here is a question of whether people can have multiple identities, whether they could be Scottish as well as British, as well as part of Europe, as well as part of a transatlantic relationship. As you know, that's a very natural thought in the United States. You can have a variety of combinations. And I frankly had a worry that if you had this sort of move towards an insularity, this wouldn't necessarily stop. I think you'd see other movements in Europe. And again, that's the bigger question of, you know, Europe has been absorbed understandably with its challenges of the economy. But again, at a time that you have shifts in world power and order, frankly, Europe, Britain, Scotland need to have a bigger vision as opposed to just thinking about what they manage. So I think the challenge now for the United Kingdom will be finding that mixture of sort of local authority, national authority, sort of regional. And you know, that's part of U.S. history. So when I used to talk to some of my friends in the Tory party 20 years ago, I would always be a little bit surprised that there wasn't more of a sense of what in the United States you'd call federalism, because that's a very conservative principle, or subsidiarity in Europe. But now that'll be the agenda for the United Kingdom.
Well, thank you, Bob, for that. I mean, it's quite interesting because in Singapore, we grapple with different layers of identity as well. And this question of, you know, being local, national, international, regional that plays, and now a lot of small states are being formed, actually breaking out from big. I'm not sure it's great for order in the world, which brings me to the next question about world order. You know, there are rising challenges of disorder to the world today. And I think these challenges come from failed states, and they come from legacy issues. And right now, the United States is mobilizing a coalition to deal with ISIS. And I would like you to put your thoughts to that. How should America deal with the problem of ISIS, ISIS?
Well, your linkage to the first question is actually an excellent place to start, because I think rather than just focus on ISIS, what one needs to recognize is that this is the breakup of the old order in the Middle East. So Sykes-Picot, but the nation-state lines that we've assumed for the past decades are frankly gone. And so one of the key questions is, what will succeed them? Will it be Shia-Sunni strife? Will it be Persian-Arab strife? Will it be tribal divisions? And these are ultimately questions that only people in the region can address, but they're fundamental to how you deal with the ISIS issue. So obviously, from a U.S. perspective, the danger here is, number one, that ISIS could further destabilize other aspects of the region, whether it be Jordan or even some of the monarchies. Second is that this becomes, as a caliphate, a breeding and balancing ground for forces that could range all across the world, this region, Europe, the United States, and others. And then there's also the broader question about attacking the United States more directly, as we've seen kind of the viciousness of these people. I think the challenge is going to be the United States has now moved towards discussion of air power, but you still see these old border lines interfering. So President Obama has distinguished Iraq from Syria. Well, frankly, ISIS doesn't distinguish Iraq from Syria. And I think that if you're going to be serious about trying to take them on militarily, you have to sort of look at where their forces will be. But the other key issue, and this really goes again to the region, is, you know, you're not going to be able to take and hold ground with an air force. So ultimately, there's a question of who's going to be on the ground. Now, I don't think it's going to be U.S. forces. And so
yes, that's what the president said, no books on.
Well, and I think in general, I don't think the mood in the United States after 2 wars over 11 years is going to support a significant, there'll be a debate about whether to have effective air power, one really is going to have some people on the ground so you can connect the intel to it and the reconnaissance and others. And I don't know, I'm a little worried how the president digs himself in on that. But the broader question, frankly, is if you feel that there's going to be conflict in this region for a long time, the United States' interests are to support those that, frankly, are going to fight those that are going to otherwise attack us. So that would mean the Kurds. I hope Iraq is a cohesive entity, but that's an uncertain question. Some of the Sunni tribes. I frankly think we've been not as active as we could have been with some of the Free Syrian forces, although they have their issues. But this brings us back to the broader regional question. You've seen that the Saudis have talked about training some of the forces. At some point, if you're going to deal with this threat, you're going to have some people on the ground. It's better if those are Arabs. But this goes back to the tribal divisions. For people in Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, their concern is if you defeat ISIS, are you creating a victory for Assad and Iran? So you see that sort of fragmentation line again, adding to some of the other points of conflict. So I think there are steps that the United States needs to take financially, air power, trying to sort of build this coalition. But I don't think people should fool themselves. I mean, this is not a question of just being able to snap your fingers or use military force. And it's symptomatic of a larger problem. And even in Asia, you know, where people sometimes look at the rest of the world and say, well, these people are a little bit crazy, you have aspects of this fragmentation here that people have to be alert to.
Right. No, I think countries in the region are concerned, you know, because of the ISIS threat. And in Australia, they just found a plot, uncovered a plot where this was going to be perpetrated in domestic circumstances. So yes, and they found 4 Uyghurs in Indonesia, linked to IS. So,
well, Indonesia is actually, if you look at the history after 2001, Indonesia is a great success story. I mean, you remember after 2001, there was some uncertainty about what would happen. And we've just had successful democratic elections in Indonesia. By and large, the economy has made progress, in part to the help of my former colleague Sri Mulyani. But and again, we'll see the nature of the new government, but I think Indonesia is a good example of people living across different sectarian lines and pulling together as a nation state.
Right, thank you. Now, this brings me to the question which is probably on many people's minds. The United States gets distracted. In 2011, the Obama administration announced the policy of pivot to Asia or rebalance to Asia. But I have to say, in Asia, there are many voices, quietly and some not so quietly, questioning whether the United States can maintain this balance given Ukraine and given the Middle East, your engagement in the Middle East, which is really sucking out all the oxygen.
Or why stop there? You've got Ebola. I mean,
yeah, Ebola.
But it's an interesting question, and it comes to...
And how do you maintain that balance, rebalance? Yeah.
Well, on the one hand, I think when the Obama administration said it wanted to focus attention on East Asia, that's a positive aspect of U.S. policy. This is a critical region of the world. But there were some unfortunate sort of aspects of that discussion, in part because the United States is a global power. The United States can't just focus on the Middle East, it can't just focus on Asia, it can't just focus on Europe, and indeed these issues are interconnected. So we were talking about the Middle East and Iran and the Persian Gulf. Well, countries in this region have as much or more interest in secure energy lines than the United States has, which is in North America moving towards greater self-sufficiency. If you think about issues of non-proliferation, those are going to be very important in Asia as well as here. You mentioned Russia and Ukraine. We're here in Singapore. If the notion that countries can take over small areas and annex them and get away with it.
We issued a tough statement on Crimea.
But my point is, for the United States to be effective, it's a mistake to think that we can just focus on one region or another. And indeed, if the diplomacy is skillful, you can actually leverage your capabilities in one region to be more effective in others. And let me give you an example. I worked in the Bush 41 administration from '89 to '92. We had some pretty dramatic events with the end of the Cold War and German unification, which I was one of the people that worked on that. But if you think about it, Bush 41 also had the first Gulf War coalition. He had the Middle East peace process. We started APEC. We completed NAFTA. And frankly, we almost got done the World Trade Organization, the Uruguay round. So it is not at all impossible for an effective U.S. leadership team to be able to operate globally. And in fact, what I could see is when I worked for Secretary Baker, the fact that he was seen as somebody who you wanted as a friend and certainly didn't want to have as an enemy in one region of the world would be supportive elsewhere. But I think the bigger challenge here is the partnership and allies you have. So when people in different parts of the world ask me about the U.S. role, I come back and say, well, what role and responsibility do you see that you will have to play in this issue? So it comes back in a way to your opening point. The trilateral system that operated for 50 years after World War II with the United States, Europe, and Japan, that day is clearly gone. And so we now have a series of rising powers, sometimes maybe overreading their press releases, as we've seen in their economics. But nevertheless, the question is, how will you share some duties and role globally? And again, to come back to kind of the rebalancing idea, I think for now in the United States, it's very important for the United States to complete the TPP negotiations as well as the transatlantic. Frankly, we have to have a working relationship with China, which I believe is possible, but there's obviously tensions to manage. And by the way, there's international economic devices in the WTO dealing with services and others that could help the Chinese reforms. You clearly need to have a good relationship with India, which frankly, the Bush 43 administration transformed to the benefit of the Obama administration. There's the question of the types of partnerships you'll have with ASEAN countries, obviously a good relationship with Australia. So you have to be able to integrate the economics and the security and the political aspect. But ultimately, and this is the last critical point, none of this works if the U.S. doesn't get its act together at home.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the key issues here, particularly for a group with the Milken Institute, is what I've seen is around the world is, number one, there's a focus on countries, in a sense, dealing with the remedies of the Great Recession, whether monetary or other policies. But the key question is the structural reforms, whether you will have the structural reforms to have the basis for future growth. And the irony I see in the United States is that if you look at the U.S. energy sector, if you look at software and big data, if you look at robotics, if you look at biotechnology, the private sector in the United States is quite amazing at the technological frontier. But the public sector is not facing up to the structural challenges: tax reform, entitlements, open trade issues, immigration issues. And frankly, I don't know how much progress we'll make over the next year or two. I think the Obama administration's running out of steam a little bit. I hope we can help them on issues like trade. But frankly, this will be a big issue for the next election.
Now, you've given a very comprehensive answer to the rebalance.
You asked a broad question.
Indeed, and I'm glad you did that, because we were worried that rebalance is defined too much in just military terms. And I think you were really very good and spot on to highlight what America needs to do domestically. And I believe this is what President Obama started with, that for America to be strong, to project leadership outside, he must rebuild the economy. It's just that you can't get Congress to agree, and some of the Republicans are not helping
Just to stop
him.
you on this for a minute, because I think what happened, and this is natural in democratic politics, I think the Obama administration overreacted to what they perceived to be the overreach of the Bush administration. And what you can see in American politics is there's now a reaction to that.
Right.
And again, I worked with President Obama and his team. I have respect for him. He's the president of my country. But I think sometimes he felt that the United States, in a sense, could remove itself, and that somehow the world would create its own equilibrium. And the reality is that just doesn't happen. But a skillful administration in the U.S. also can't do it itself. The question is how you build the coalitions, the alliances, the institutions. And I think you see that happening. So it's very interesting to look at the public reaction in terms of ISIS. What you see on the one hand is the American public is willing to support action. But I think quite practically, they realize it's not necessarily going to work so easily either. And I think that's common sense.
Right. In fact, I think Henry Kissinger, in his latest book, World Order, I haven't read it, I read all the reviews. Apparently, he is arguing that, the absence of American global leadership is really leading to all this fragmentation and conflicts, sort of flare up, and there's no one to put out the fire, I guess. And do you think political will is returning to the United States if I watch the coalition and the reaction to ISIS? Is it too soon?
I think it's a subject of debate. I think, as I mentioned, the fact that the reality is the United States went through about 10 or 11 years of war. And that's very hard for a democracy to withstand. Mm-hmm. On top of that, we've been through one of the deepest recessions since the Great Recession. And it also goes to this sense of kind of sharing the load. There's an attitude in the United States that says, well, why is all this thrown on us? I mean, if you covered Washington, you went out and saw the country. It's always interesting. So there's a problem with Ebola in West Africa. There's a problem with Russia and Ukraine. There's a problem in the Middle East. It's always, well, what's the United States going to do to bail it out? If you travel the country, there's a lot of people, not the people that this audience would meet, they're trying to live average lives, trying to get by on their income and their salaries and trying to get their jobs back. And they say, well, why is this all on us? Now, I do think skillful leadership, and I mentioned Bush 41 as an example, could organize that, but he didn't win a second term.
I know. That's right. Now, I want to come to China and a discussion of China, because the U.S.-China relationship is the most important relationship of this century, and certainly from this region's perspective, we do see it that way. But the United States and China have a complicated relationship. Each of you want a good relationship with the other. but there is a strong element of rivalry, and if I may say, there's a deep sense of strategic mistrust. When you were Deputy Secretary, you coined the term responsible stakeholder to try to bring China in the system. How do you see the United States and China going forward with their relationship and forming the relationship?
Well, let me put this back in the context in which you established of kind of the world order. If you think about it, what the United States with others in this region and around the world helped create was an international economic order and a security stability after World War II that allowed the greatest period of growth and development in world history. China was a key beneficiary of that. So the Nixon and Kissinger policies with opening, the support of Deng Xiaoping, the effort to integrate China into the world economy was part of the Chinese strategy, certainly for Deng and Zhu Ranji, to drive their own reforms. And this I would describe as an integrationist model. Now, if you ask Henry Kissinger, he would say China operates with a tributary model, so it can't accept that sort of integrationist model. Xi Jinping has talked about a new type of great power relationship, and it's a little unclear exactly what that means. I was with him with a few other people in early July, and he actually connected it to responsible stakeholder, and it could be connected, but I think that's for China to fill in. So I really think, and there's going to be a discussion on this tomorrow at another session, I think one of the issues will be China clearly has accomplished a tremendous amount. It has a sense of pride, restoring its place, sense of nationalism. It wants that to be recognized. But then the question is, what type of order does it want in Asia or the world? How will that order fit with others, people in Southeast Asia, Japan, India, and others? And is there a way to accommodate that? So the notion of responsible stakeholder was simply to try to recognize after China came into the WTO that China had benefited from this system. Obviously, it would need to have a say in the future system, but to try to make the case to the Chinese that rather than challenge the order, it should try to work with it. And from a US perspective and regional perspective, that would be in everybody's benefit. But that's the big question. So you can talk about strategic dialogues and others, but and ultimately this has to be implemented through specific actions. So let me give you a concrete example. When I was in Beijing not too long ago, I was making the case that when you look at the types of reforms that China is seeking to make, were outlined in the third-party plenum, that they could use some aspects of the international system in the same way that Zhu Ranji used the WTO accession. And I talked about how a bilateral investment treaty could be helpful in terms of cross-investment, but also in supporting the reforms in China. The Chinese basically accepted this, and they've actually moved towards concepts like a negative list that are quite far-reaching, but they still have to execute and implement. Similarly, service sector. I mean, if you look at the reform process for China, the service sector is going to have to become more competitive, more productive. This is what held back Japan and others. You can see this throughout Southeast Asia for countries trying to avoid the middle income trap. There's a WTO negotiation that would open service sectors that doesn't require all the countries, but just the ones that participate. So my point on this is that there are ways that the United States, with its global role, can find some common ground with the Chinese. Energy. I mean, if you think about the energy needs in China, the technology innovations that come out of the United States, the additional production and productivity, these could be of great benefit to China as well. So I think the challenge with China would be to try to find the mutual interests, freedom of the seas, energy development, dealing with some of the carbon and pollution issues. But frankly, then manage some of the differences which we see, for example, in the South China Sea.
But I think there is this overarching question, because the Asian order has been a predominantly American order from the end of World War II to now. I think that predominance of the United States is being challenged, and I think this is what the issue is about. And the question is, what is going to be the new order? We do not know what is going to emerge. China clearly wants to have a much bigger role. I think Asians are watching. And how will America accommodate China? And as you say, the accommodation must be something that suits the rest of the
Well, that's a key point here. Is that,
but that, I think, is the key.
Yes, but this is where those in the region will also have an influence. So will ASEAN act in some cohesive fashion?
Yeah, we've got to
so
try.
The United States has made the point in the South China Sea that we have to have freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation, that, frankly, these disputes over resources and undersea resources, these should be something that people should be able to sort of accommodate and work out. If, however, China wants to do this to establish a new type of tributary or hegemonic relationship, I don't think Japan and others in the region are going to go along with that. And then we've got, put it this way, in the terms of a book that's now been popular, you're sleepwalking towards a new, different conflict because the old order breaks down and you're not replacing it with something that offers stability and security.
Right. Now, I'd like to turn to trade as the next question. The trade scene globally is not looking very good.
It's terrible.
It's terrible, and WTO looks broke. The Bali package, which the trade ministers negotiated in December 2013, well, India is not being ratified. I think the Indians are not very happy with the way. They don't think that food security.
I don't think the rest of the world's very happy with the Indians, as I understand.
They don't feel that their food security concerns are met. But trade is not moving. TPP is actually
It's a good point, this point I just mentioned. India is a big, important country in the world economy. 149 other countries all agree.
Right.
India has, frankly, a position it can defend its food security interests. It tried to grab more. And if the Indias of the world, or the Brazils of the world, or the Chinas of the world feel that they do not share a responsibility for the international economic system, the United States will manage. It's a big economy. You won't be as good. The rest of you will be in worse shape. So frankly, everybody needs to say to the Indians, to Modi, this was a mistake.
Well, I think it was agreed during Manmohan Singh's time, perhaps. I think maybe Mr. Modi, Prime Minister Modi would like to put his signature a bit on this and then come to some agreement. But you are right, we all have to talk to India.
Thank you.
Right. Now, but can I ask you this question on TPP? If you were negotiating the TPP, well, I don't want to put you in difficulty or embarrassment, but do you think America needs to be more flexible to close TPP?
I think America needs to exercise political will. And let me put this in a context. Look, I like Mike Froman. I urged him to take the job. I think the TPP and TTIP, as well as I emphasized the WTO negotiations on services and digital accord, are very important. What I've been worried about is that their view of politics has led them to trim their sails. Earlier this year, Republicans and Democrats came together for a bill to offer trade promotion authority, which is the key authority to bring back an agreement for
Harry Reid said no.
Harry Reid said no, and the Obama administration folded. And again, even as you look to this period, whether there could have been some effort to start to create the basis for the trade promotion authority. The Republicans in the next Congress have been very supportive in the House and the Senate. So one of the ironies may be a Republican victory in the Senate might be very good for President Obama's trade authority. Okay? However, the question is, and you know this because you've been part of trade deals, we struck one with Singapore and the United States, you ultimately need somebody that has the will to close. And everybody in this audience has seen there's people that can analyze, there's discuss, and there's people who can close. So the test here will be whether the administration is willing to work with the Congress early in the next Congress to get the trade promotion authority. The reason why that's critical is that of the 11 countries the United States is negotiating with, we already have free trade agreements with 6 of them, okay? And we're adding Brunei and New Zealand. This is primarily Japan, and to a degree some issues with Vietnam and Malaysia. And so the Japanese want to use this as part of their structural reforms, the third arrow. The United States should be supportive of that. But Prime Minister Abe is not going to take a fundamental political risk of taking on some of these questions with sensitive issues unless he knows that President Obama is willing to actually be there, and we'll fight to get the accord done. This is one of the questions of leadership, to be honest. It's not just enough to talk. You have to act and you have to do things. And so the challenge is ultimately whether the administration will push to get this done. And the reason I'm glad you're highlighting this is TTIP is in worse position, frankly. And if these agreements basically just drift, and that's about where they are now, then this is not going to be good for the world trading system. So I'm certainly a Republican who would be more than willing and have supported the administration, but the administration has to figure out how to close. Now, as your question on flexibility, these are always the questions of negotiation. I will say this. One of my former European colleagues, when I asked his view about the administration, said they're very good at setting the bar high for others.
Yes.
So one of the issues here, if you honestly believe in free trade, yes, you have to open your own market too.
Absolutely.
Now, and frankly, this is why I like being a trade negotiator, because the things I was giving away, quote, were actually going to make my economy better, is a question of managing the politics. And we still don't know whether the administration is really committed to opening markets, exercising the political will, and closing these deals. And the reason I'm stressing this is that one of the things I've been troubled about with the administration is you've got some very articulate people. The president gives very good speeches, you know, but ultimately the presidents that I worked for, what actually matters for coalitions, for trust, for liability, is doing things. And the key point for the United States is you have to watch out for your friends, you have to actually listen to what they want to do, and for enemies, you make it distinctly unpleasant. That's how you create leadership.
Thank you. Now, I think, you know, this is great, and I would love to carry on with Bob in this way, but I would like to open the discussion to the floor. I'm sure there are many questions, and here's your opportunity, Mr. Robert Zoellick. Questions, please. Now, I can't see because of the light. Yes.
If you could maybe just explain who you are.
Yes,
sure. Manraj Sekhar, Fullerton Fund Management in Singapore. You touched on India briefly. You talked about China, Japan. You've got new leadership in Japan with a huge challenge in revitalizing its own economy. You've got new leadership in India. We know the challenges the Chinese leadership have in reforming their own economy. We in Singapore tend to have a very pragmatic view of how these different economies should engage each other for the region. There's an opportunity for all those different leaders to move ahead and deal with their own issues for mutual benefit as well. What's the American perspective on how we can help them achieve those objectives and achieve your own objectives as well?
It's a very good question. Your opening comment reminded me, a Singapore friend of mine said to me yesterday, we've got a lot of Type A leaders in the region now. And frankly, maybe we could use a few Type A leaders elsewhere in the world too. Putting them all here may be a bit of a challenge, I don't know. It's a good example of how the United States can play a catalytic role to help those that want to drive reforms. So in the case of Japan, you know, I think Abenomics is driven primarily by Prime Minister Abe's desire to reestablish Japan's influence. He's not Milton Friedman in terms of his sort of economic logic. And what we all know is the third arrow is the critical piece. That could be very much connected to the TPP. So strategically, TPP is not only good as a trade opening agenda, but to support the structural reforms in Japan. In the case of India, I think it would be wonderful for the United States to sit down with Modi and say, what are the things that we could do that would be most helpful for your structural reforms, and have that sort of exchange. Some of this is infrastructure development. In the case of what I think Modi is correctly recognizing, a lot of it is the execution of their plans. When I was at the World Bank, we had very large sort of commitments, but they often would not get expended because people didn't sort of have the follow-through. And in the case of China, as I've mentioned, I think we should try to look for, whether it's the services negotiation, bid, or others, how we can support those. Because part of the challenge for the most important power is actually how you support and help others. That's how Thucydides had once said, you know, we make our friends not by asking for favors, but by doing them, okay? And if you look about U.S.-European relations over time, I was part of German unification. What was really key was we kept our promise to Germany in unification. So obviously you have to preserve your own national interests, but what I've described are structural changes that should also be in the U.S. interest, but require a certain outreach towards your partners to try to be of support. There'll be some that are difficult. For example, Japan and Korea in their historical animosity. That obviously for the long term is something that the United States would want to try to see how we can remove some of the causes and basis of that. Some of that will have to be done behind the scenes in terms of sort of how people engage. But so I think the same agenda is true, frankly, with other parts of the world. Now, ultimately, and this is where one has to draw the line, the United States can't solve everybody's problems for them. So we can be an enabler. We can try to help put together coalitions of support. We can try to use leverage from one area to the others. But as we've talked about in the Middle East, ultimately, that decision is going to be up to the Arabs in the region. And frankly, for those Islamists who want to have Islam have a different face to the world. That's one we can help those that want to take that course, but we can't do it for them.
Another question?
Over here.
Please.
Just to give you one other example that's close to home. I was in Mexico last week. I made the point about structural reforms. The Mexican government of Peña Nieto has been making some extraordinary structural reforms in terms of energy, telecom, anti-monopoly, and others. There are aspects that some people quibble about on the tax side and others. This is America's continental base. We should be doing things to help him succeed. And so, for example, some of these energy reforms are going to take 4 or 5 years to show the benefits. But frankly, if we expanded some of the electrical grid in the Southwest to Mexico, you could get the benefit of our natural gas prices for lower electricity that would help Mexican manufacturing, and we'd create North America as a stronger economic platform. So part of this is sort of thinking a little bit beyond the talking point agenda.
There was a question.
Yeah, here, over here. Jared Carney, Lightdale, also senior advisor to the Milken Institute. China has 3 of the world's largest banks. Russia is pursuing its own foreign policy and its relationships, particularly in its former backyard. Brazil has financed its own oil and gas industry. What's the future of multilateral institutions, particularly the World Bank, in the 21st century?
They clearly have to adapt and they have to adjust. Part of the challenge is how do you sort of integrate the rising powers in the system. And let me give you an example, because a lot of the news often focuses on the potential conflict. I just talked about Mexico. China has wanted to actually invest more in Mexico, but they didn't want to be doing it in a pure bilateral fashion. So they picked up on an idea that I had launched at the World Bank with IFC, our private sector arm. We created an asset management company that would be able to tap various capital flows from pension funds or sovereign wealth funds or others. And just last week, I learned that that fund had created a special Mexico investment fund that China will contribute to, so that China decided it would actually be smoother if it operated through a multilateral system. Frankly, you know, you read a lot of discussion about this new infrastructure bank. I mean, this is something that the World Bank and others should partner with. I mean, the World Bank needs to see itself as part of a broader network. Frankly, infrastructure could be very important for middle-income countries trying to remove some of the barriers to sort of productivity improvements. And frankly, the World Bank has a lot of experience with those. When I was at the World Bank, I created a small unit in Singapore to try to draw global experience about creating public-private partnerships for infrastructure, recognizing that we wanted to try to move from a series of one-offs to something that could be more of a deal flow. And we actually worked with the Singapore government to try to create a fund, putting some money from IFC, but also from various sources in Singapore. So there are ample opportunities here to be able to kind of work the multilateral system. But as I also suggested, the multilaterals need to be flexible and adaptable, but the emerging powers also have to decide where they're going to be committed. So as I talked about this point with Prime Minister Modi, I mean, the WTO system will not survive in its present form unless some of the rising powers take some of the responsibility for that system. And then to give you another example of how I think that needs to change, I think the era of having 150 countries agree to everything over 500 topics is past. We're going to have to try to create the possibility, as was done at some earlier points, where if you get 50 countries or 70 countries, 100 that agree on government procurement or services, you let them go forward and you let others join. So these are where we're going to have to adjust some of the rigidities in the multilateral system.
Thank you. There was a question in the middle. Yeah. Yes. Please. Yeah.
Kevin Chen, I'm a China-based entrepreneur. Towards the end of your tenure at World Bank has done a joint study with the China State Council Development Center called China 2020. For people in the private
2030.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
For people in the private sector, we feel most of the hard structural reform was done under Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji. If I could say so, we feel the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao years, it was pretty much a lost decade in terms of further market reform. So when your report came out, and particularly under the joint auspices of the State Council, we were very encouraged and anticipating a lot more opening up of new industries and new sectors, and without state-owned enterprise hogging most of the resource. In your view, how is it going so far?
Okay, well, and let me connect this to the other question, because this is a very interesting example. Some of people in the audience may know this, but many may not. China had a very good relationship with the World Bank, going back to Deng Xiaoping and Robert McNamara. And at various points in the Chinese development process, the World Bank worked with China on the analytical side. It wasn't a question of money, it was a question of trying to give assistance in terms of the next degree of reform. There was, in the 90s, there was or the 80s, there was a floating seminar on the Yangtze River and others. And that was the origin of this 2030 report. Some Chinese officials came to me when we had the 30th anniversary in 2010, and they said, Bob, everybody thinks the Chinese enjoy anniversaries, and we do, but let's make something out of the 30th anniversary. So why don't you, in the World Bank, suggest to our leaders this report? And so what was important was that Li Keqiang and others, also at that time all the other leadership, not only agreed to do the report to look at basically the questions of middle income trap, but they assigned us a Chinese partner, the DRC, as you mentioned. Now, skipping ahead, the China 2030 report, if you look at what came out of the third-party plenum, you can see a lot of the interconnectivity of those ideas. So that's a good thing. And I think the starting point is, since I made a broader reference to structural reform in all countries, it is impressive that the Chinese leadership, after 30 years of 10% growth, realized they have to change the model. Now, what's happened? My own sense is that in Xi Jinping's sort of early period, he's focused on consolidation of power. And this is partly the anti-corruption campaign, it's partly the new Security Council, it's the new party leadership groups in the economic area. And I think to understand Xi Jinping's logic, this is part of a purification of the party to have the party play a leading role. As you know, there's a great concern among some of the party members that Gorbachev did exactly the wrong thing, that he abandoned the party and he weakened the party, so they have to clean up the party. The challenge that I see, however, is that early stage is creating a lot of uncertainty. And you get a feel in different aspects of the Chinese system that they're not quite sure of where they can move, or is the anti-corruption campaign really to clean the system, to develop a rule of law? To what degree is it going after enemies to be able to consolidate power? There's some very traditional Maoist elements that are brought in here in terms of the personal correction campaigns and self-correction, self-criticism campaigns. So on the one hand, I think when I've talked with some of the economic reformers, they say, look, we have to have this power because it's going to be very hard to move the system, okay? I mentioned I was with President Xi in July. I was struck by the degree to which he was focusing on the party. And he kept repeating the 86.68 members of the party. And I think that was 86.68 million members of the party. I think that was a sense of kind of his perspective. Now, what that means is when I've talked with people like Wang Yang or Liu Jiawei or Governor Zhou, I see a structure, and what they've explained to me is to say, look, don't just look at individual details. This is, in a sense, a new stage of reforms that we can't break the old system and start again, like, in a sense, Deng did. We kind of have to create new structures of governance. And I think you'll see this, for example, with Liu Jiawei's effort for the fiscal system, the role of the provinces and the taxes and others. I think you'll see this in terms of trying to deal with the hukou system and sort of the movement of peoples, because that's a sort of a key issue. The big question mark, and at least in the newspapers I've seen a blowback on this, is that moving towards an open capital account and an open financial system is also a huge, huge step, even if it's done gradually. Now, there are interests in China that will resist this. And so I can't tell you today how that will work out in the process. But I think as an outsider, but somebody who's been interested in China, I think the most important has been this consolidation of Xi Jinping's power. But I hope there's a recognition in China that that actually could be an asset, but if it's not handled properly, it could actually create a different problem. Ultimately, China, to be a successful economy, has to move to a rule of law system. And the question will be, how do party members fit into that system? So, coming back to the private sector, what I think the officials recognize, and there's a book that just came out in Washington by Nick Lardy at the Peterson Institute that's gotten I think he wrote a piece in the FT recently, was what's quite striking is where many Westerners think that state capitalism is the driving force of China's development. What Lardy shows is, no, it's the private sector. When you look at job creation, if you look on return on assets, you look on exports, as you may know, you now have greater Chinese private investment in the United States than you do on the public sector side. So I think the challenge for the leadership will be taking on some of the old structures. And my one worry is that, that the system will get bogged down with some of the uncertainties that have created by this campaign. But that's where that will be the story still to be told.
There's a lady in front here.
Thank you. Yan Qing from China. My first question is about TPP. I hope it is not a provocative question for you, which is how long should China be kept out of it, TPP, when China had been showing a kind of willingness to join in? Second question is about G20. If China tried to seek to preside the G20 in 2016 after Mexico, what would be your comment and your suggestions on that? Thank you.
They wanted to
preside.
Preside? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, look, here's the nice thing. I'm an American. I'm used to all sorts of attacks and questions, so you can ask what you wish. It's a little different in China. So the first thing is we have to complete TPP, okay? And that's going to be a challenge as itself. But the reason that I mentioned this bilateral investment treaty and the services accord is those are, in a sense, core provisions that you would find in the TPP. So I've actually argued to the US officials and others that you can't just focus on the TPP and TTIP. You also need a strategy towards continuing the support of the reform process and openness in China. And I found on both the services negotiation and on the bilateral investment treaty that some of the economic reformers share this view. And let me give you one other specific one talking about hosting. There was an ITA, Information Technology Accord, in the late 90s that was critical for opening the supply and logistics systems, a huge boom. The United States and other members of that group have wanted to, since it was 10 or 20 years ago, be able to expand the list of services and others. China has not yet been willing to accept a broad list of expansion. China hosts APEC this year. So one of the things that I actually talked to one senior U.S. official is I said, look, why don't you work with China so that it could have a nice accomplishment for its APEC meeting where it agrees to the steps necessary to join this accord, okay? But interestingly enough, and this goes to the practicality of diplomacy, China invented bureaucracy. So when I said to this U.S. official, have you talked with the Chinese, before you get to the APEC summit to try to help them work through their own system, that wasn't kind of on his mind. But that's a good example, whether it be information technology, services accord, bilateral investment, those are the building blocks for China being part of something like the TPP. So get the TPP done, also work with China in the process. In terms of the G20, I welcome China's hosting international events. And frankly, in my experience, China was a pretty cooperative player in the G20. There's a lot of talk about kind of responsibility. If you look at the stimulus program that China put in, China and the US had sort of the biggest stimulus programs. There are obviously some frustrations at various points, really, with currency and other issues. But it would fit my strategic logic of having China have a sense of responsibility to have China host such a meeting. And so whether it be APEC or G20 or other commitments in the WTO, that's a good example of how the United States and others can support the reformers in China while supporting the international system.
Thank you. Have I reached the end of the time? I have. Should I take one more last question? Is there a burning question? I can't see.
Yeah.
Yeah, please, a burning question. Short?
Very short, yeah. I just happened to work at the World Bank doing Jim Morris and Paul and under U.S. Wealth. But now I work for a hedge fund named EJF and kind of went to the dark side. My quick question is, I think part of the reason that China is very active in setting up the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the BRIC Bank, is they feel very underrepresented, with the World Bank and IMF. So in the foreseeable future, how do you think either the president from the World Bank or the IMF could be selected from through emerging markets, Asia, or Brazil, instead of just US and Europe?
Yeah, let's test your hypothesis, though. There was a restructuring of votes in the World Bank under my tenure, which, by the way, got through the U.S. Congress, unlike the IMF one.
Right.
It goes to a little bit of this challenge about how to get things done in Washington. And China was the biggest beneficiary. Second, I brought in the first chief economist from the developing world, Justin Lin, from China. You now have a Chinese head of IFC. I talked about IFC's private sector arm. That's a Chinese official. So to be honest, I didn't run into a lot of complaints about China feeling underrepresented. And it's an influential sort of partner in the bank. What I do think with issues like the infrastructure fund is that there were aspects where, because others wouldn't contribute, that China would create other types of funds. And frankly, when I was at the World Bank, we worked with the Islamic Development Bank, we worked with the regional banks. We should work with the infrastructure banks, or the World Bank should. Coming to your question about leadership, here's the key question, and it goes back to some of the earlier discussion. I have spent most of my professional life trying to engage the United States in the multilateral system. Remember, we've talked about this security order, this economic order, these other aspects, environment. It won't work if the United States isn't part of it, but the United States can't do it by itself. Just be careful what you ask for. The United States will never have a UN Secretary General. The United States will never hold many of the other international posts. The United States has never had an IMF. The United States has never had the WTO. The United States is precluded from most of the other UN organizations' sort of leadership role. So frankly, I don't think it's such a bad thing that the United States has a sense of responsibility for having some of its nationals head some of these. Now, does it have to be the World Bank? No. I'd be happy to move to the IMF. But that requires people opening up the notion of a more open possibility for Americans. Because be careful. If you start to take Americans out of these organizations and have no possibility for that, then people like me are going to have a harder time getting the U.S. Congress and the public to support them.
Yes, thank you. Now, I think because of the time constraint, I have to bring this session to a close. We have really covered a lot of ground. You've just seen Robert Zoellick in action. The way he thinks is comprehensive, is incisive. And thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to